Well, I'm really happy that we can host this panel session hybridly. I'm Layla van Ellen. I hope we're going to manage well with Christina being almost in space. And with me, I have Angelo Vermeulen, who's a space systems researcher, biologist, and also artist. And he works on bio-inspired concept for interstellar exploration at the Technical University of Delft, with a specific focus on self-replicating architecture and biological life support. Through collaboration with NASA, ESA, space companies, and various academic and cultural institutions, he has developed a transdisciplinary perspective on the futures of space exploration. So welcome, Angelo. We're really happy to have you. You're also having a keynote tomorrow as well, so join us for that as well. Christina does not need an introduction anymore, I think. She gave us plenty. We know what she's on about now. And then our final guest panelist is Richard James MacCowan. Richard is an award-winning multidisciplinary designer, and he works worldwide on urbanism, manufacturing, and agricultural projects. He has a background in international real estate investments and development and sustainable design, combining this with behavioral science and nature-inspired design. So Richard is also the founder of the nonprofit Biomimicry UK, and also the current initiatives they're working on at the Biomimicry Innovation Lab involves the development and delivery of investments into UK-based scientific research and development, with a focus on nature-inspired innovation and the circular economy. So welcome, Richard. Really happy to have you here in person as well. So we had prepared already quite a few questions in advance, but I think we really want to tag on what Christina said, and bear with us when we go from Christina onto us, because we need to unmute ourselves. So hopefully this will work out quite well. My first question, I want to start with Angelo. We are seeing today, and also in general, a surge in research in biomaterials, both in architectural context, but also space contexts. And in your opinion, is this surge related to solving more technical issues, or is it because of things like the biophilia theory that we were discussing, or both? What do you think?
Let's hope that everybody can hear me. I guess that's all right. Yeah. Yeah. Why this sudden, or not this sudden, this interest in biomaterials now? I don't think it has anything to do with biophilia, to be honest. I don't think that's the reason. I recently saw a very interesting movie that kind of taps into this. It's the latest movie of Richard Linklater. It's called Apollo 10.5. I don't know if some of you have already seen it. It's out on Netflix. And the movie is partly a documentary, and it really shows beautifully the 60s and the ideas on progress and technology in the 60s. And it's quite jarring if you see how people were handling all those new products that came out in the 60s. Like, for example, there is a scene in the movie where children are running behind a truck where DDT is just being sprayed in the streets. And it's something fun to cycle in the cloud of the DDT, and all kinds of other examples. So it's really the age of a synthetic world that came up, which is completely the opposite of in the age we are now. Now we're really very much focused on environmental safety, personal health. And I think the interest in biomaterials is really because of that changed sensitivity towards materials, towards products, to what we do as an industrial human civilization. So I think that's really much more the reason. The reason for that. And I think secondly, and that's something that has also only happened the past few decades, the realization that in contrast with modernism, basically, where mankind was the ultimate intelligence to solve all problems, the realization that actually a lot of solutions are out there and are out there in the world and have been found through evolution. And by actually analyzing that and connecting it with computing, you can actually disentangle these solutions and apply them to solve problems for ourselves. And I think that framework and that way of looking at biology in a very almost respectful way and being in awe for how smart these solutions were found And then learning from that, I think, is also something that contributes to this interest.
Yes, of course. And I think this is also what biomimicry is all about. And I think this is a good segue into Richard. Do you have anything to add on to that can you tell us maybe quickly what biomimicry is? Because this is as well being in awe of what nature has designed over evolution, or how do you see that?
Yeah, biomimicry or nature-inspired innovation is really about, how do we look at biological mechanisms? What are the principles they're replicating, process manufacturing, systems, to shape, form, function, and process. It's really expanding now. You're seeing a lot of research in the UK developing. We've just done some research, over 125 research labs, 1,500 academics, and a lot of the ways the government funding schemes are going. Actually, a lot more academics, as you know, are wanting to commercialize.
Oh, is your mic on?
I think so.
It's not working. Can they hear mine?
Can you hear?
We can hear the host. Okay, then we're gonna use the one microphone.
Where was I? Oh, there we go. And I can hear my own voice. How horrible. God, I sound Scottish. I am. Yeah. Yeah. So I'll start again for obviously the people at home. Yeah. So biomimicry nature inspired innovation is about looking at how nature solves problems and translating that into our, environmental, technical, sustainable, regenerative solutions. And you're seeing everything from AI through to new novel materials, drug development, down to nanomedicine, up to materials science and complex systems for next generation infrastructure. It's really taking off at the moment because a lot of people are actually getting and understanding the complexities of building companies where people like angel investors, venture capitalists are willing to take more of a risk. A lot more academics are actually coming out, and there's no offense to anyone in the room, or anyway, it's about coming out of silo and understanding the value of collaboration across different disciplines. What you can learn if it's just a chemist and engineer working together and a biologist, and actually understanding that you're all doing the same thing and but your language is different and each wears a different colored tweed jacket. But yeah, it is this kind of biophilia aspect. I mean, that is one of the problems as well with biomimicry, because people get too latched on to the biology. And I don't know if there's any designers in the room. You're always told never fall in love with your prototype. So it's about not falling too much in love with the biology as well, because you can end up just being so obsessed and not wanting to let go because you'll fixate on one thing, which could be good, and you could end up with a brilliant solution, but it could be the wrong one, and you'll have to then search for other, mechanisms in different animal species, fungus, plants, whatever, that are doing the same thing. So it's those kind of things, using it as a stepping stone. The rise in biomaterials, I think we're seeing, a number of companies creating the product, realizing it's successful, and everybody else is jumping on the bandwagon, especially, looking to mycelium materials. That is, positive steps coming out of that. Some negative ones as well by one of the bigger companies in the US who create patents across Europe and actually have tried to kill the market there, but companies are finding ways around that. I think you're now seeing a lot more labs testing it, whether it's into clothing, textiles, are actually understanding now that it's not just using it and killing it, but actually understanding the value of the network. I believe there's research came out early in the week, they're actually understanding that there's a communication there, whether it's actually like a language or it's just sugar, nutrients, communication, electrical signals going across, but understanding the value of this big complex network. And this really ties into the issues with space applications. Are you actually replicating the big enough ecosystem or habitat, or are you just taking a small slice? It's a bit like the bit Bosco Verticale in Italy, Milan, where a lot of people say it's like a forest, vertical forest. Well, it's not, because it's just lots of trees. It's nice and it helps, and it's about shading, but it's not actually there's not the interconnectedness there, and understanding that.
Right, thank you so much. I think building up on that, what we've heard today, and especially in the discussions we took outside during the breaks, we were talking about making all the systems more efficient. So not just having trees, but having all the organisms, really building ecosystems and thinking into ecosystems. So building, designing, engineering. And especially when we move to space, we want to be efficient because it costs a lot of money, time, efforts. And so we're looking into efficient systems and bioreactors, for example. However, if we are solving everything in a one-pot solution, how does that work with risks? Because a one-pot solution carries greater risks in terms of redundancy. And if we move to space, we need to be redundant. And I'm talking here more into systems, maybe instead of nature. I don't know if Christina, do you have an answer to that?
Sure. I mean, I think the idea is less sort of one pot solution, not the eierlegende Wollmilchsau, the pig who lays eggs and gives milk at the same time, but rather sort of a frame of mind, to say a framework. That if we were, and I'm very happy to hear that it's not the biophilia that drives some of these solutions, that it would actually be sort of a technical approach, a new technical approach, because as you said, there's a risk in like loving the object of the solution, which I think many architects, such as those who design buildings with trees on them, which are lovely, do sort of respond to. But if it's a technical solution, it's about building a framework to support multiple variations on a theme. So bioreactors as part of a system which is involving growing plants, as part of a larger connected framework, a system of systems, an ecosystem. It's less saying that this bioreactor will do all of these things, rather reframing your habitat to say, well, we're allowing for growth, we're allowing for different kinds of processes to happen in hopefully a redundant way within that habitat, so that you can then make use of multiple functions.
Right, Angelo, you want to add on?
Yeah, I think it's a good moment to clarify maybe something that is often used in systems thinking. You can optimize a system or you can satisfy a system. And this is really crucial to understand what we're talking about here. Space exploration currently and space technology currently is still in this mindset of optimization. It's the best production with the least amount of resources in the shortest amount of time, right? With the least weight, the least cost. But that only operates under those predefined conditions. Now, what we're talking about, I think, during those 2 days is humanity with ecology moving deeper into space for longer periods of time, where more and more risk is coming in, that unexpected things are going to happen. And this idea that by gradually testing every single contingency and then always using that to optimize your system, at a certain point, you have to give your system autonomy to solve its own problems, right? Now, for that, you need to satisfy. You need a system that satisfies what needs to be done. What does that mean? It means that instead of trying to squeeze out every gain that you can get, you basically build in bleed. You have basically a system that is not as efficient as it could be, but there are multiple parallel pathways that could do the same thing, which of course costs a little more. But because of that, you increase the resilience of the system and the flexibility of the system. And that is really a mindset that we still need to make that shift. And it's not very compatible with a capitalistic mindset. That's one issue there. So I think that's really at the heart of many of the things that we're discussing here.
Oh, Christina, you want to add?
Yeah, I'd love to just that there's also a difference between efficiency and effectiveness. And this is a definition which we use sort of in environmental systems on Earth. Efficiency being this filter removes 95% of this particle, very efficient. When you take it into context in an entire space, the entire life cycle, that's when you start to get something towards effective. Like, what did it take to produce that filter? How many times did that filter get replaced? And how much energy did that take? Where did it go? what was the volume of the room, how many people were in the room. That starts to get at the definition of effectiveness versus the definition of efficiency, which is how we measure most single instance systems that come out of the room. Which exact thing did it do versus taking it into context. So I just wanted to make people aware of that definition.
Christina, I think from what we're talking here, we are staying into systems and efficiency, which sounds very technical as well. And I'm wondering, how would you see the biosocial and relationships with humans, with more than humans in this context? I don't know if, James, you might have thoughts on that.
What do you mean by more than humans? Plants or aliens? Or Donald Trump? Well, it's kind of thing, we were talking there, thinking about redundancy and actually how, inefficient the human body is and how much waste we produce. Are we in charge, or is it our gut microbiome, or is it also down to the microbiome in our skin, or all of that considered together? It's also considered, who's really in charge of the planet. We're killing off all the trees and there's runaway climate change and everything else like that as well. So actually then the planet will actually come back and survive. We'll just disappear. So yeah, how do we interact with those things? Yeah. Whew. First of all, do we need to travel to space? Why not allow plants to go and we stay here? Because we could design computers or everything powered by bacteria, plants, and they could be the ones that colonize. Why do we need to go? What are we going to learn from that? I know it's about, we can develop new technologies. It's just me thinking outside the box. I keep thinking about, we have to send astronauts and, space explorers, and they've got to have a certain mindset. But how do you, what if the plants were in charge and they were the ones that are actually controlling the environment? Or termites, especially termite inside, the mound, building termites where the CO2 levels are higher, and actually they work in conjunction with the enzymes that they actually produce to glue the grains of sand and mud together, and the fungus. So instead of create a controlled environment, why don't you have an environment that's heavily reliant on fungus and bacteria, but having the right type of fungus and bacteria, and then doesn't allow the spread of others? That was completely left field.
That sounds great, but how do you determine which one are the good fungi and which one are the good bacteria and the ones that we want to promote growth, and which one are the ones we want to avoid? Like we've seen in Christina's presentation that fungi, for example, is being researched, and especially mycelium for Earth, for potential building insulation. But also it's one of the biggest problem causing health issues inside the built environment. So how would you define those?
It goes down to actually then, do you want to ensure that there's ventilation systems in there as well? I mean, that's one of the issues. HVAC systems, I think Christina had in the video, are actually quite inefficient. And actually, can you look into more of the natural world about how actually airflows, oscillating airflows work, and actually instead of just singular air transfer, that could be allowing you to capture particles as well, and finding ways to regulate the moisture levels is the big thing by putting in plants. I'm hoping that for those of you online, there's a wall outside that looks like it's got moss in it. I don't know if it's real, but obviously sphagnum moss is very, very good. It was used as battlefield wooden dressing, as well as antibacterial properties. They actually had factories of actually would collect it in World War I and II. Is that something as well you would have there that controls the moisture levels by removing any excess around? Obviously the issues with zero gravity and things like that as well, but I'm sure there's something ways to deal with that. So yeah, it's a tricky one. Which one is the good and bad, and which one fits in with the system? Because you've got to think which some of the fungus is actually bacteria are actually useful to break down the waste that comes out of your human body. Or do we just do like in Star Trek Discovery, where they make all foods that are, the replicators? I think that was the thing where they said that's where all the food comes from, basically the proteins from human shit, effectively.
I think we can use a few basic metrics to determine if everything is going well with our life supporting system. I think basically the two major ones for me would be, at this point, biodiversity and individual health. I think that's really the key thing here. You start with a particular diversity of a number of species you bring together. And then if that diversity rapidly decreases because one or of the species completely takes over, I think that's the moment to start controlling the system back to a more original state and individual health. And that's something you can just measure. I don't think it needs to be that complicated.
Great, we like to hear that. It doesn't need to be that complicated. I want to go a little bit further than that, and thinking of Christina, you told us about we need more data, which I think will lead maybe to more physiochemical ways of seeing nature and using nature, like using plants as a tool, for example. Will that mean that the more we know, there's actually a link with the more we engineer biodiversity? And if so, would this be something that we want to change it and to be actually further away from life as we know it on Earth? Christina?
Well, yeah, this goes back to like how much is emergent versus how much are we wanting to control, to domesticate, to use for our means as we know them, versus sort of allowing behaviors to emerge. I think you know, it's really a matter of, again, how much risk we're willing to take, how much we're willing to absorb, what kind of amount of uncertainty we're willing to live within, and how much, you know, could we create a system with enough biodiversity at the start to be resilient, to be large enough to be biodiverse enough to be resilient to multiple things, and sort of be able to control and control to a certain extent, and sort of a layered approach. I think it's really important and incumbent on us to decide whether use, as you said, like use, domestication, tools, using other things as tools is okay with us. How would we know if those other things are okay with us using them as tools? Do we not breathe? Do we not give the plants carbon dioxide? Is that what they want? Did we give them enough light? Is that what they want? How do we know what it is that they would want? How do we know that we're living in symbiosis? Is it a matter of like letting them self-replicate? Is replication itself a sort of sign of autonomy? How much autonomy can, and just saying the words, how much autonomy can we give them, already implies that we are in the position of giving some other thing autonomy, which is a very difficult position to be in. But how do we move from where we are, which isn't completely controlled, and we want to be able to maintain ourselves to sort of allowing other things to exist with us in a symbiosis. It's interesting that you brought up the ants or the termites. Why not send the termites or the plants? Not that they would want to go anywhere. The question of why we go to space at all, it's a very interesting question, put aside. But I often wonder if the termites could do it. If the termites had opposable thumbs, would they do the same things that we do? Would they be exploiting their ecosystem to the extent possible to keep their families and their line alive? You know, where do we as humans decide now in this age that we're going to allow for, where do we draw the line between like we need to control that much versus we can allow for that? Where are we like fine with it being not 18 degrees inside, but maybe it's sort of 20 and that's okay, instead of like it must be between this thermal range and this humidity range, or we don't, you know. I think it's sort of a balance between learning where we want to release control and learning where we're able to, you know, what control means to others, other non-human life.
Okay, yeah. I think it's not really a choice we need to make. I think both approaches can work together. We can have a core system that is pretty much controlled as a safeguard, and then a shell around it where a lot of more emergence is being allowed. while, just as Christina indicated, monitoring is of course vital. And monitoring is vital. The smaller your system gets, the smaller the reservoirs get, the more vital it is to measure things, because everything is tightly connected. So if something goes wrong in one compartment, it just penetrates all the other compartments. So by just having that core that you can rely on, and it is in fact a bit more controlled, and having a layer that is uncontrolled where things can happen through emergence, I think that would be a beautiful world. But in fact, this is politics, right? This is society. I mean, imagine, of course, you can be a libertarian and be like, no more government. Every day is just whatever happens. No, we don't. Most people don't want that. Or if you, I'm not an anarchist or a libertarian like that. I love government to, control a few things. And then around that, there is this layer of culture and creativity and initiative. I think that's perfectly fine. The same thing with agriculture and nature in cities. Agriculture, super controlled. And we could perfectly have our parks just give them their agency and have them develop whatever they want, instead of controlling them as if they're agricultural patches. So I think just bringing the two together, to me, seems like an interesting solution.
Right, and if you're thinking of bringing the two together, I think it's also merging disciplines. And we see, for example, with us at HBBE, we see these multiple disciplines going from synthetic biology to materials designers, chemists, engineers and architects. How do they work together? Do you see that as a government is doing the tight-knit thing, and then around it, we build around that, and there's sometimes interrelations? Or do you see these relations as we need to collaborate, work together, or is there some type of hierarchy? And I want to start with Angelo, and then I want to go to you, James.
Yeah, with our collective, with our Seeds collective, which I'm one of the co-founders, we've been crafting our methodology of co-creation for many years now, cross-cultural co-creation all over the planet. And co-creation is almost, I mean, it's been overused, it's been completely absorbed in corporate context, but we're still using it. And the important thing is with co-creation to precisely define it. And the way we define it is that in true co-creation, you're basically creating a culture in which people are allowed to step into other people's domain, to reflect on those domains, to come up with solutions, not necessarily of course, not having that background. And then in the next step, and this is important, that those ideas are taken seriously by the professionals and are integrated, because otherwise it's just a window dressing opportunity or occasion. Now, that exercise requires really careful guarding, because many people are naturally territorial about the stuff they know and the stuff they do. And they are feeling uncomfortable that non-professionals are suddenly having this input. Now, the thing is, because the unprofessionals do not have that background, they might come up with completely different ideas. And that's what, I mean, all of us here are convinced of this. I'm basically preaching for the choir here. But in the wider part of society, that's something that you still need to explain. But the thing is, why is this? What are the consequences here? Well, first of all, the consequence is that actually what you're doing at that moment is you're unlocking the collective intelligence of the group, which I find tremendously interesting like that. But at the same time, this process needs facilitation. It doesn't happen organically. I mean, if people have been doing this before, probably it'll come more natural. But I think facilitating this without too much ego, because ego destroys these kind of processes, too much ego, that is really key. So that's my personal experience on bringing together all these disciplines and really looking at it as creating a culture with values in which you operate and work with each other.
Yeah, I agree. No, yeah, you got certain rules. I mean, I scribbled down when Angelo was talking about if you have too much openness with how things are changing and the way the policy is going, that's where the lobbyists come in, and then you're seeing that with rumors of that's what's happened in the IPCC report of actually removing some of the solutions because of the power of big oil or coal or whatever you want to say. So, but there is this value of actually, if you can create a set of rules, giving people a framework, because a lot of the things you design is for everything. You know, I was always told in urban design class, you're a facilitator. You are designing for people because it's the users. You don't know about the space. You work with the local people. You bring them in. You know, and I like the phrase collective intelligence. I think that's Nest. I've got a brilliant playbook on that. I was involved in a project at the beginning of COVID and still kind of listening to that with people all around the world. Random people talking with some finance who works in Wall Street, talking with a student in biochemistry is looking into basically using cow urine as a biofuel in Nepal. But they're all talking about the same things of issues of climate and all these things again, and actually coming up with common solutions. And you're seeing that now with industry pushing open innovation. You know, there's about 20 or 30 platforms. It's one thing we're actually actively studying. My company is actually looking at where the trends are, what are the issues, because companies have realized innovation's tricky. And we can't always do it. If you're so fixated in one area, you need some fresh blood. You need that random person. You know, the funny story is how Colgate ended up selling more toothpaste, and they were all stuck thinking, right, how do we go about doing this? Do we change the viscosity of the, you know, the toothpaste itself, change the material? You know, and it didn't. The random story is they were sitting there brainstorming, really stuck, and then the tea lady came in and she goes, just make the hole bigger. That's it. Somebody's fresh thinking could just come and do that. So it's that kind of thing of valuing the randomness. Somebody somewhere has got an idea that's better. It might be completely across different disciplines. And this is the value of looking to art, science. I mean, I think is it the Krebs cycle that Neri Oxman kind of transposed, and actually you can tell how much influence we've had because my company logo is actually based on that as well. And the value of looking across disciplines. When you look into kind of supercars, there might be technologies in there that can have health benefits. That's why McLaren Applied Technologies are now working with their data science and their engineers to actually work in medical applications, even though a lot of it came from Formula One and, you know, in supercar development. But it's about cross domain. You know, textile innovation are working with materials scientists who are making mycelium boarding, but it's also going into that. You know, there's that great report by Biofabricate on the textiles. And then you're talking about them going down to the manufacturing, which has multiple applications as well. And I think we're getting to this point now where, because we're looking at cross domain, and I mentioned it earlier, getting various disciplines working, and that has to go down. Sorry, I'm on a bit of a ramble here. That has to go all the way down into the DNA of our schools and our universities, and really promoting that. So you're not just, you know, blinkered. We need to open it up to study anything, build your own almost degree. You know, some architects, designers do that, engineers, everyone else reading around it. But we need to just get everybody under. It's not like some people say, oh, I'm a polymath. Everyone should be doing that because you need to learn, you know about so many things. Teach your kids coding, even though they might not use it, but they understand the language of the future.
Christina, would you like to add on to this?
I want to build on what he was saying. It's really fundamental also sort of in an academic world about how different silos earn a living, right? Interdisciplinary work is hard because it is not the main whatever interdisciplinary project one might be working on is not necessarily the main focus or the life bread of any particular discipline. We may be working on a project that involves a chemical engineer, and it would be great to have a chemical engineer, but you know what, he's working in the lab, working on the work that he needs to do to make his publication, to get his, you know, to get his next level of funding. And it's very rare the opportunities or those moments where one finds the moment to actually have different disciplines make a living. And it's really important that they do that, to like make a living at the interdisciplinary intersection. And maybe if we had an educational system which already didn't preference those silos, maybe there would be some more fluidity to that. But it really is interdisciplinary. It's another wonderful buzzword and bandwagon, but it is and important. But we need to make that also economically viable for people who are, you know, at the moment working in the silos, and that's where they earn their living.
Great. Yeah, I think it's really interesting. I also, while we're talking interdisciplinary, I want to get the audience used to the idea that you can ask questions as well. But first, let me ask, when we are thinking of innovation, interdisciplinary really drives that. When you say someone comes out from somewhere else and think, well, why don't you make the whole bigger? But how do you see that at some point when we are working on an innovative idea, how do you increase the technology readiness level when you're working in interdisciplinary fields? Because this can be difficult regarding methods. For example, scientific and designer methods have a very different approach. And how do you still increase the maturity of the technology? I don't know, James, you look like you're a bit.
I think that really depends if you work in academia or in industry. One of the things we're seeing is actually you don't need to have everybody involved in the project. You bring in the specialist at that stage because not everybody has to think about everything. Some people like and very good of studying example bioreactors and catalysis and that. They can then come in at that, and then you have somebody leading that stage of the project. I mean, a lot of innovators we speak to is they're coming up and say, actually, you have the facilitator to get from A to B in the stage gate, and that's their role. They could be the accountant, they could be the designer, the marketing. It doesn't matter, but they know how to get from A to B, and then somebody else C to D, and then at the end of that, you want a terminator. I think I'm winning on the film quotes here, aren't I? Yeah. Having it to then understand if you need to kill the projects as well. So I think that's it is tricky at universities because of time constraints, budget constraints, or how the funding's spread out. But I suppose it's just a case of, and also here's another thing as well. I don't know how many other people, I mean, obviously the HBBE's obviously got a lot of funding, but a lot of people who are doing in biomimicry and biomaterials, where do you sit? Do you sit in engineering, your research council, or biology, or into some sort of chemistry? And how many people have had it where you put a grant into one and then they tell you to go to the other, and then the other one tells you to go to the other, and you're kind of, where do we sit? Is that where the private money needs to come in? The UK government's trying to, mainly because it's not got a lot of money, like most countries, is trying to promote private finance. And you're seeing this big growth of venture capitalists really wanting to experiment, because most of the companies invest and fail anyway. So why not go back to the fundamentals and actually work with the academics and get them understanding that they can actually solving challenges for industry straight off instead of working the fundamentals? Not that it's bad to work in the fundamental research.
So it sounds like everyone should be a polymath educated, but so that you gain respect for each other and each other's fields, but we still need a specialist in order to really develop the technologies. And I was wondering, for example, looking at the Melissa project, what did you learn from it? Because I think both Christina and Angelo, you're quite familiar with that project. What can you learn from it in terms of what are the next steps into scaling up, for example, a project like that? Because it feels like you say there's this approach of the social, but there's also the technical you're figuring out, and the smaller the system, the more complex it is. Did you learn anything going through that project and getting to know that project on where should we look at next in terms of research for closed loop systems? Yeah, Christina, would you like to answer this first?
Sure. I mean, the Melissa project is amazing. It is an amazing evolution of looking at living systems. And I think I like to look at it in comparison to Biosphere 2, because Melissa is highly controlled, wanting to understand behaviors at sort of very fundamental levels. Only gases, liquids, elements pass through these chambers. Whereas Biosphere 2, much more open idea, at least, of, they're in concert with each other. And for me, as an architect, I come in and see these as two very different approaches to try to do both tools to try to understand two very different approaches. And I come into as an architect and also embed into that, like what are the kind of worlds that we're trying to create or live in. If one may be a better tool, is one a better space? What's the difference between an architectural space and a tool at this point? But no, it's I think for me, next steps is to understand, do we need to continue to maintain a level of control that is expressed by the Melissa system, or are we learning from that ways to be more open, ways to have these systems sort of interact together in what we would maybe think is sort of a less engineering method and more of biological, ecological methods. So that's my reflection on them. What do you think, Angelo?
I think we pretty much agree on everything. It's not so much of a discussion here. Yeah, I actually was at the Melissa pilot plant last week. I was there in Barcelona. They have a setup of many of the components of the Melissa system. It was very interesting to see it. There's a few drawbacks to the system. I mean, on one hand, the Melissa system really aims to understand each individual organism or each individual species in their system as well as they can under all kinds of circumstances. So the level of control is extreme, or the desire to control is extreme. But at the same time, it's a minimal ecosystem. That's how they describe it themselves. That's the language they use, a minimal ecosystem. It's not like Biosphere 2. Biosphere 2 is really the polar opposite of Melissa. That was like putting 3,000 species together. They called it species packing, a concept that I think I never heard of before. And then the idea was that the system would kind of stabilize itself. Well, that went a little haywire during the first experiments, even though Biosphere 2 was a tremendously interesting experiment. So I always put them in opposition to each other. So Melissa is very minimal. One drawback here is that the menu you get out of that is somewhat limited, of course. And humans are not machines that just need some molecules and some energy each day. You need a little more variation there. So that's one potential problem. But the second problem is what I talked about before, tight coupling, right? So it's a minimal ecosystem, just a few compartments. It's all super optimized. If something goes wrong in one of the compartments, the whole cycle breaks down. So I think for me, it's clear that the next step will be to make these redundant additional paths, to build in redundancy, to make the whole system more resilient, but also to create an output that is more culturally representative. So it really becomes a system that is more representative of Earth. So really moving a little more towards Biosphere 2 without avoiding all the chaos that we've seen. There is, for me, probably a next step.
That sounds like a great challenge. James, do you want to add on?
Yeah, I just got down Barcelona, so I'm going to go there on my next trip. Thank you. No, I agree. I was just scrolling down the kind of the different ideas of starting off with Christina mentioned John Todd's Eco Machines, then looking at Biomatrix as well, slightly bigger. You got Melissa with the control, but up to Turinscape, the Chinese company, to vast, landscape architecture and ecology company, are doing vast sites of former industrial land around the world and actually building in reed beds and parks and turning it into landscape art, ecological urbanism as well, and looking at that scale, because it's getting me thinking about, there's a research concept called low entropy cities, because I don't believe the circular economy is ever going to be achievable. I think it's a utopia. I think it's very, very tricky, because as it's like back to that thing of what is perfection, and getting a complete, entropy isn't it absolute zero, or in a vacuum. And can you actually achieve that on Earth? Because is Earth a closed loop system? Actually, because it's reflecting, but like Angela and I's head, we reflect the sunlight back into, so everybody should shave their heads, and that way we can reflect all the sunlight back into space. But then we'd all die from some skin cancer. But no, the point being is actually, if you're building in these nature-based solutions, all the things that ecosystem services, but also then the feedback as well for the planetary health. So actually, we're upping the game. So you're building in, like reed beds along coastlines, mangrove swamps, which actually have got multiple benefits for schooling fish, filtering water, slowing down tidal surges as well. You're seeing the Billion Oyster project off of the coast of New Jersey, and actually the reason why that New Jersey is flooding in New York because of when people moved there, they took ate all the oysters. So I really think we have to look into this kind of, as both Angela and Christina said, is letting go of control and building this thing up. I mean, there's one thing I would look at. There's the Center for Biological Inspired Design at Georgia Tech. They've built a model it's called ecological network analysis, and they look at basically the energy flows between species. It's originally based on the economic model, which then they looked into ecosystems, which they now look into factories and other systems to actually look at the importance of building in different elements of the system. And it's looking about what can you add in, what systems can you tie in there. So yes, I think it's about letting nature be whatever nature is.
So a little bit of chaos for us because we're not understanding exactly what's happening, but probably it's very well evolved over the years. I think I want to ask if anyone in the audience has questions for our panel. Looking very quiet. Do we have anyone on the chat online? There's no questions. Well, great. Yeah. Please use the mic.
I don't know if you've touched on this a little bit before, but just want to know, in your experience, do you think there's any kind of emerging technology in terms of like bioarchitecture or biomimicry or engineered living systems, like that, what Stefan said, that would benefit from like a huge influx of cash? Like, so if you think about like SpaceX, Starlink system, like all the technology, all the fundamentals were already there, but it just took someone to come along with a bit of courage and a lot of money to get this, system off the ground. So is there anything like that might exist coming up in the pipeline, I guess? If that makes sense, sorry.
Well, there's quite a lot of companies. I mean, we were talking earlier about the research we've done. So we completed this stupidly big study of every single academic institution in the UK, and every single academic found over 1,500. Probably missed out. Most of the PhD students are not on academic websites. Over 125 research labs as well. We know more about some people in the room than probably you know about themselves, because we're basically looking at what the trends are, who's doing what. So we're seeing a big rise in AI, chemical engineering, and biomaterials. The big issue with the biomaterials is actually how do you scale up? And this goes all the way back to the very first talks this morning, is how the companies that are doing well are understanding the manufacturing process as well. So example, Ehab, who's doing his PhD at Newcastle, he's founded Biohome, and they are working on installation boarding, mycelium-based installation boarding, and they've understood the value of creating a distributed network of manufacturing hubs. So you're working with local farm waste, so you can then supply that around to different sites as well. But yeah, this is the key challenge, and yeah, this is something we're actively working on with a number of investors to actually push this forward. You're seeing a massive rise in investors not just saying we want to invest in biotech and AI, but actually into biomaterials. You're seeing that because of into fashion and textiles, but it's about getting them to change their way. Those companies are great, but are they going to see them in mass market? But do we want to see like fast fashion using mycelium based or pineapple or whatever based? Because that's just creating another. It's just creating another issue. I mean, I kept this coffee cup here because I was looking at vegware. They say it's a biomaterial, but how do you dispose of it? Where do you dispose it in this building? Anyone? No, because it's PLA and it can't go in standard home composting, and it can't go in the recycling because it screws it up both the ways. The reason why Australia banned it. So, we have to understand it's the manufacture and dispose on the whole towards a circular or low entropy economy of how do you keep things going. So there is, I think, because you're seeing the promotions, say people like Janine Benyus or Ellen MacArthur and various other people, Rocky Mountain Institute, pushing the need to kind of go back to biology and keeping things going round, or Cradle to Cradle. That is where things are coming from. You're seeing that companies can do it. And most companies are not the laggards in innovation, they're just watching. the key thing is you don't always want to be the first to market. You want to be the best. Almost let somebody else create the demand, and then you just follow through. They punch the hole in the wall.
Christina actually raised her hand, so I'm going to give you time. In the chat, please. You can hear me? Hi, Christina, can you hear me?
Oh, sorry, there you are. Okay, sorry.
You noticed.
No, I wanted to follow up on what Richard was saying, that, you know, it's also a matter of how you frame the projects that you're working on. And what I heard him talk about was like, well, that's a life cycle analysis framework. Or if you talk about the Ellen MacArthur Foundation and circular economy, there are certain ways that they frame and phrase the way that they're moving forward in industry. And also, like, ecosystem services framework is one way to talk about it. Life cycle analysis, energy analysis, circular economy. They have that, it's like a building of metrics in order to talk to investors. And it's interesting because it's one, we can think about the Living Building Challenge, LEED, you know, BREEAM in the UK. These are frameworks which are set up in order to sort of communicate to investors and industry, like, look at why this is valuable. And, you know, are we in the moment where we have to pick and choose between which frameworks we're using to communicate that value, or do we have to come up with a new kind of framework to communicate that value? But I think that's really incumbent on, like, well, what are we going to fund next? Is like, well, how are you describing that value that you're bringing to investors, to the world, to space? What is the framework?
I'm gonna walk over.
Thank you. Yeah. So I have two questions. So the first one is about the facilitation you were talking about. So which do you think are the best scales of facilitating in terms of, for example, if you talk about global intelligence, would it be possible to facilitate a global, people from all around the world raising solutions, or maybe that's not sustainable, or maybe it's not possible in time, energy, and money. And the second one would be that I'm seeing like a very stark contrast between two different let's say communities. One that is the one that is focusing more on virtual bodies and on, like, Instagram, Facebook, metaverse, everything that is not physical is virtual. And then, but we are biological beings. So are we going to come back to our biological problems, or are we going to continue developing into a more virtual world? Yeah, maybe this was too much like for the yeah.
Let's start. I think that's a lot of food for thoughts. Anyone keen on starting? Oh, both. Okay, Richard.
That's a tricky one. So you're talking about moving towards the singularity, so we all live in the metaverse, where we can all Will Smith, somebody who runs Facebook. Yeah, it's a tricky thing because that's where you're seeing a massive growth in AI based on swarms, neuroscience based, DeepMind, and various other companies spinning out of universities actually because they're looking to neuroscience and understanding this. It's getting me thinking when you were talking there is about everyone's an inventor, especially when you're a child, but not everyone's an innovator. So how do we tap into that around the world? That's the way I see it. I think we should, what are we now in industry 15? 4.0, or no, it's Industry 5, where it's about personalization. That they'll need of actually understanding the connection between the biology and the technology. You know, one of my team did a research project at Royal College of Art, and it was about putting sensors on trees so humans would actually feel what a tree feels when the wind changes in different times of the day and temperature and those kind of things, and those kind of biofeedback loops. I do think you're going to see more and more of this. You know, you've got apps that can plug in, you know, smart sensors from, you know, urban agriculture that you can actually understand with soil health and things like that as well. So, you know, I've been asked this before, do we move away from technology or do we embrace it for the power of good? I think we use it in the right place. You know, it's a bit like, you know, we're working in informal settlement work in Cape Town. Would we go in there a bit like Harvard did with VR headsets? Well, that's rude. You want to go and understand the human problem, not just say, look, we got a bunch of technology. We're using technologies to understand how they change, but we want to use, it's about human-centered design and understanding what people need and what the environment needs, not just chucking technology at for technology's sake.
To answer to your two questions, the first question about the facilitation is actually, it's a really good question. And yes, I think there are limits to the scale in which, as an individual or a small group of people, you can facilitate. And in our projects, in the SEEDS projects, we've been facilitating up to 150 people co-creating one architectural structure without a plan, just day after day adding and removing, which is quite an interesting process in itself. But I guess that's about the limit. And at a certain point, you need to reorganize your community, maybe with a number of layers or something. It's all about keeping communication open and transparent. I think that's just the key there. In terms of the virtual, I'm a bit of a gamer. If I have time, I don't have so much time, but I love computer games and I try to play them, old games, new games. And I've been thinking about this a lot. And I think this dichotomy that you're describing, like either or, is a false dichotomy. I think actually the physicality of human existence is always very present in anything virtual. So I think it's a misconception that there is a shift. First of all, in the devices that people are using, they're very physical, very tangible. These interfaces, they break down, there are new models coming out, there's software updates. So people are very conscious about the device that is generating that virtual world. So there's a physicality there. Also, a lot of virtuality is about connecting with other people. And I know this from multiplayer computer gaming. People are like, oh my God, gamers, and they just, you know, they disconnect from the world. No, they live in very intense communities. It's super social. They're not antisocial. No, it's super social. So that's also a misconception. And then another thing that just struck me now is that a lot of the content that is being discussed and explored in virtual worlds is actually physical. If you look, you mentioned it yourself, Facebook, Instagram, you know, all the classic social media channels. How much food is on there? Tons of food on Instagram. That is super biological, super physical. So there's always that connection, always bouncing back and forth. So I have no worries that, you know, people will forget their biology.
Do you think this actually could be a tool for us to communicate with organisms or plants and include them in the discussion? Because we are thinking of how we're looking at using them or going into space with them, but it's really us deciding between ourselves. But could the virtual world be a communication between those? I don't know.
Maybe we're getting ahead there because I mean I can't understand my wife, so I don't know about understanding everything else. But yeah, it's actually, there's a really good book by retired professor. It's called Technobiophilia. She's got a blog as well. I'd really recommend it. It's about how do we actually building in, you know, the essence of nature into our technology, where we're naming it, we're building it in the metaverse, you know, these kind of things as well. Yeah, the understanding of relationship. I think you're seeing a lot of that, you know, as we're studying mycelium, trying to make communication, you know, with different animal species as well, understanding growth, how they interact. I think there's that. It's really academic who wrote that book about what a plant knows or what a plant sees, and understanding the different changes throughout the season and communication. If anyone's watched BBC Green Planet recently as well, you know, you're seeing actually complex world just at a different time frame. It's about how do we value time and frame time as well. So I think that's the kind of thing of understanding how things grow and change and adapt, whether that's looking at kind of, as we talked about agency, basically building in randomness mistakes as we see for ancient cities. Why do we like going to ancient cities? Can we do that for space travel as well? Building in those randomness, building in the mistakes that actually lead to something better.
Yeah, and it's the interspecies internet that was launched a couple of years ago, I think, in an attempt to bring in other species onto the internet. Well, to a certain level, we might be able to communicate with some of the animals that are closer to us, but on another level, I'm pretty pessimistic that we'll ever be able to have profound conversations with plants or bacteria or anything else. And I think if you start thinking about this deeper and deeper, you get stuck because it's impossible. So on one hand, you want to, okay, let's decentralize the human, but then you have no way of properly communicating with them. So you have, and probably they don't care about humans at all. They're probably not even interested in us. So it's this difficult situation, but maybe this is a moment to rephrase everything and to go back to something a bit more ancient, which is just respect. Maybe we should relearn how to properly respect nature without even understanding it. Maybe we should learn to respect the other again properly. And that's a much deeper philosophical and ethical reflection that is needed, way beyond let's build a machine that translates the language of a plant into human speech.
Those are great thoughts. I don't know what I could add on. I'm wondering if anyone in the room wants to add on to that. Josh?
Got a slightly different question. I'm going to go back to technology. Is there a danger that we're trying to innovate ourselves out of a problem without really solving the root cause of it? I think you bring up a really good point about the coffee cup. I personally work in biomaterials, and I think, while it's really cool to work in biomaterials, I would hate to think that the materials I develop are going to fast fashion or like being disposable cups, because I feel that those issues are societal and really require social change rather than a technological change. So is there a danger that we're focusing too much on technology and not investing too much into social change?
Christina?
I think that we can solve a lot of technology. We can solve a lot of problems. As soon as we define the problem, we'll figure it out. And that's why I think it's true that the question, the why, like the fundamental, why did we do that? Why are we looking at biomaterials again? That's why that's the critical part. And if when we get to the basic why or the fundamental why, well, what was it? Was it a sustainability issue? Was it an issue of using resources? Was it an issue of environmental change, which is more of a social justice issue? When you get really fundamentally down to the why you're doing it, the answer might not be that it's a technological solution that you're after. And then you have to change fields, and that's okay.
I think also it's important, how do we know the basic why? How do we know that we know in that sense? And what are the skills that we require to know and ask these questions? Richard?
Yeah, I was thinking there, we were talking about, is there not like almost 200 definitions of circular economy? One of the first ones is refuse. Why do we need to keep buying stuff even though it could be bio-based, or, especially if it's clothing and it's bio-based, but it's from H&M or other brands who have 52 seasons a year. You're not actually helping anything. Yes, it could go into the ground, but all the energy. I think that's the big thing. If anyone's read Bill Gates' book, it's very heavy in the technology compared to other ways of where we're actually just building in the nature-based solutions. But a lot of it, and this goes back to actually, because we're trying to move away from sustainability, people forget that sustainability, if you go back to the Brundtland report, was actually about protecting future generations and about people as well. So what's the social aspects and understanding how do we work with the community and building that? What's the value of working, say, getting community to build community gardens, or having people, Bruce talking about working with children and that, and actually getting them to, our students working on projects for the space station and getting them empowered, these kind of things, giving an education to all. I think that's the key thing of giving back to society and understanding that, we're seeing that the space race, because of the costs are dropping down, but who's actually benefiting from it? We don't all want to just watch a phallic symbol flying into space. Some of that money should be put back into actually community good and actually getting, people educating as well. So it's that social, very, very big push, especially in we talked a little bit collective intelligence for social innovation.
I think we're going to wrap up soon, but I also think we might leave the audience or you for last comments and thinking, I think when you work into space, everyone asks why. Why should we go to space? Why should we develop technologies? Because of all our issues we're facing here. We've seen it throughout the presentations as well. Stefan showed it really well. We've got a lot of things to solve here on Earth. So why would we go to space? Would all of you just close this with a short statement if you can? I know it's a big question, but also know we've all answered this before as well.
Yeah, I think, I look at space as an emergent part of humanity, which is inevitable. It was bound to happen. There was no stopping. There's nobody who made a plan or a decision, let's go to space. This is really, you look at human history, this was bound to happen. And for me, it's much more important, instead of trying to answer the question, do we need to go to space? It's more like, if it's part of the human drive to go into space and to extend human civilization outside of the atmosphere of Earth, which is basically how I look at it, how do we shape it? How do we contribute it as individual creatives? So for me, that's more my position. So I think in the beginning of the space race, I was looking at, you could look at space as something that was out there and you had to jump to get there. Well, the image that I have in mind, that I hold in my mind, the mental image, is basically space as an extension of civilization, reaching from the bottom of the sea and extending further and further from the planet. And it's impossible to disconnect it from our lives. So we might as well better really deeply think on how to shape it. So that's how I look at it.
Yeah, I think it's for me, it's about the push for innovation and working in extreme environments and seeing that transferred into solving problems on Earth. Christina talked about controlled environment agriculture, and you're seeing like new materials and things like that as well, which actually can be transferred. And because different governments are really pushing that is where the innovation is happening, really pushing the boundaries of tapping into different areas of governments who are actually pushing the space rate for communication actually, and then seeing actually what we're using with space-based technologies of actually like the planetary computer that Microsoft is developing as well. Actually, that can do good by actually looking into ecosystem services. So that's, for me, it's about how can we actually use that.
Great, thank you so much. Christina, do you want to conclude?
I think that you both brought up two aspects of science. I can't remember where I read it. There's two kinds of aspects. There's two sciences: applied sciences, where you're using knowledge to some purpose. So the pursuit of knowledge in space, the pursuit of these technical solutions towards some purpose using the tool that we have. And then the other is knowledge and understanding for its own sake that we seem to want. And that's part of the both, I think. Two sides of the coin.
Yeah, I think this is a really good conclusion of our panel session. Thank you all very much for joining from all over. Thank you, everyone. I think this concludes our first day. We're really, really happy for the audience here on site, and we're really happy to invite you for networking drinks as well. And also the audience online. We'll be happy to see you tomorrow at 9, I think. Same spaces. The physical Catalyst space here in very grey Newcastle. And from wherever in the world you're zooming in from. Thank you so much. And I look forward to start discussions and talks. And thank you, Christina. Hope to see you in real life soon.
Love to join you for drinks.
Thank you so much. And let's get some drinks and some discussion going next door.